My name is Teresa Piacentini, and this is Lecture 4, Part 2, looking at emotional labour. And the aim of this recording is to debate how Hochschild's work has been used and developed. And so we've already been exploring the usefulness of early Hochschild's work in understanding the commodification of emotions in the workplace. So looking at how her work has been debated, the first thing really to point out is this question that's raised by Bolton and Boyd and Wharton and Brooks and Ledner is, are we really just crippled actors, right? The concept of emotional labour implies that workers cannot exert any active and controlling force in relationships with management and customers. And this is a challenge because it suggests absolutely no agency on the part of employees. The company exhorts people to smile more and more sincerely and at an increasing number. Workers respond to the speed up with a slow down. And so what Hochschild does, though, is she recognises this critique, but also challenges it. She does say that there is some resistance there, that workers in her study pushed back, so they perhaps slow down the speed up of delivering the service. There is also raises a question around resistance, right? The transformation that Hochschild talks about in the emotional life of the employee arguably disqualifies the possibility that employees may exert any active and controlling force in relationships with management and with customers. Bolton and Boyd demonstrate how actors in their study are able to draw on different sets of feeling rules according to context and their individual motivations to do so. Thus, it's not always the organisation that defines the emotional agenda, they find. Employees are also skilled emotion managers. And whilst the organisation creates the parameters of control, defining what constitutes good service, via mechanisms such as scripts and customer care programs and training manuals, they argue it is the worker who regulates how much feeling is invested in the performance. She has also been criticised as treating subjects merely as victims, and Bolton and Boyd instead found that airline crew were fully aware of offering an empty performance without buying into organisational norms. Ledner talks about going off script, so again building on this idea that introduced by Goffman, that interactions are tightly scripted, and Ledner found in their study McDonald's workers attempting to individualise their responses to customers in small but personally meaningful ways, using humour or exaggeration to demonstrate their distance from the script to which they were expected to adhere. So it's not just about getting by, Ledner found, but also about getting back. But Hochschild does explain that management is seeking to intensify emotional labourers' work. There is this corresponding reaction by many that undermines any such efforts and protects their perceived value of their labour power. And as Brooks argues, workers can seek out unmanaged spaces, and so Hochschild's account of resistance does demonstrate that she understands that workers are reflexive and possess the agency to begin to challenge their alienation. The next point here, is it always the workplace that defines the emotional agenda? What about relationships? What about structures outside of the workplace? And these are largely missing from Hochschild's accounts about where the emotional agenda comes to be defined. Is it only about the lone worker with singular emotions? Well, what's missing again here is a consideration of team effort. If it's all about social interaction, the worker doesn't exist in a vacuum. They are part of a wider team, and there is little mention of the different types of social emotions that individuals draw upon. Bolton and Boyd argue that Hochschild underemphasises the basis, the form and significance of collectively forged organisational space for worker agency and activity outside and within the commodification process. Hochschild offers a view of organisations as flat and lifeless landscapes, But where is there any sense of the satisfaction and enjoyment and reward that can be gained from various forms of emotion work? Where is the innuendo, the humour, the imperfect customer service, as Bolton and Boyd ask? There's also the positive consequences of emotional labour. And Sharma and Black set out in their study in the analysis of the benefits of emotional labour in maintaining a business for self-employed beauticians that emotional labour is a central aspect of the job. It is actually a combination of deep and surface acting. They emphasise that the work of self-employed beauticians can't be standardised, and actually the work is dependent on each individual customer needs. They found there was no training manual to depersonalise feelings, and that each beauty therapist delivers their own style of service, so they are actually following unwritten rules to keep the repeat client. But as Chong argues, then it is the marketplace that still compels us to perform emotional labour. But also, what about genuine emotion? The possibility for spontaneous and genuinely felt emotions. Is it still emotional labour when the employee is fully aware of organisationally desired emotions? And continuing with this critique, there are different behavioural expectations depending on who is doing the emotional labour. But Addison asks, what is the point of deep acting? Whilst Hochschild describes the practice of deep acting, she is not really clear or convincing, it is argued, about the purpose of deep acting. Hochschild tries to convince us that the point of deep acting is to make a feeling that is imagined seem real, so that it becomes real. But why an individual would perform deep acting is unclear and fuzzy. Addison instead draws on the work of Pierre Bourdieu and this notion of habitus, the idea of knowing, to argue that we use knowledge of how to act and feel in certain situations, and a knowledge of how to express and, importantly, manage our emotions. In this sense, there is no real or false sense of self. I wasn't being myself. Rather, Addison argues we experience a feel for the game and a corresponding response. Now, this also speaks to Bolton's critique that individuals are overly structured by feeling rules and lack agency, and Brooks' response that individuals can in fact seek out unmanaged spaces and be autonomous. And these are some of the arguments you'll be engaging with in the tutorial exercise for this week. But this feeling of being uneasy with our surroundings, like we don't fit in, that Addison argues Hochschild misidentifies as a splitting of the self. This feeling of unease and conscious performance, Addison argues, is connected to an awareness of a lack of knowledge of how to act and feel in a situation. The emotional dissonance, the disconnect then, is not an argument to support the idea of a false self, but rather indicates a feeling of being out of place in a certain social space and around certain people. Intersectionality exposes how identities are linked within interlocking systems of oppression. And we have intersecting identities around race, class, and gender. And what form one's behaviour should take is not the same for everyone. And what is considered appropriate or moral is determined by our social location and these intersecting hierarchies of race, class, and gender. So there are different behavioural expectations depending on who is doing the emotional labour. And these different expectations are based on social norms which construct identities that privilege some at the expense of subordinating others. And in Hochschild's work, there is, Chong argues, and others, a failure to integrate an analysis of how the interaction of race, gender, and class affects the expected performance of emotional labour. Racism and gendered racism is silenced. And while emotional labour involves the overt shaping of the worker's identity to match perceived social norms via uniforms and scripts and so forth, the more covert forms of reinforced social hierarchies, those that are classed, those that are racialised, those that are gendered, need to be recognised. And this is particularly so in the context of a global division of labour. Racialised identities are part of corporate images, after all. And in Nath and De Cruz and Neurona, we see how emotional labour comes to be colour-coded through national identity management, so names and behaviours and responses. And coming to kind of an end on this point here, this question of dichotomising distinctions, Hochschild is criticised for her tendency to dichotomise the distinction between the private self and the commodified public self. Emotional labour also exists in the private sphere, not just at work. And in fact, in the 2003 edition, Hochschild does respond to this, recognising the blurring of home and work and the marketisation of private life, and so does respond to a critique of the analytical value of emotional labour beyond the workplace. So let's recap. Emotional labour, as Hochschild conceived it, refers to the work of managing one's own emotions required by certain professions. And emotions become commodified in this process of emotion management, so they develop and exchange value. So we've looked at the concept of emotional labour, and we've analysed the management of emotions and looked at how this concept has been critiqued and developed in a number of different studies. And I think the key takeaway messages that we want to draw from this examination of emotional labour is really to think, for those of us who are working or who have worked, think carefully about how we too have engaged in this kind of emotional labour in our own lives, and what this has meant in terms of our sense of ourself in the workplace and our sense of identity. And we can also see in the concept of emotional labour the way in which sociological concepts have their own trajectory, because Hochschild has really developed much of the concept of emotional labour, building on Goffman's dramaturgical approach.